his abdomen to see what was in there. And when he saw what was inside of Willie, he just froze, having no idea how to react to what he was looking at. He had never seen anything like this in his entire career, not even close. And so the medical examiner just grabbed a camera, took some pictures of Willie's midsection, and sent those pictures to Captain Lewis. The next day, Captain Lewis sat inside of an interview room in the police station across from a 45-year-old woman named Paula Green Albritton. Paula owned and operated a funeral home along with the help of her son, and she had been the one responsible for Willie Suttle's burial. And so Captain Lewis asked Paula about Willie's burial, and she would tell him that Willie had actually died in poverty, without any family members to help cover his burial expenses. However, when Paula had found out about this, she said she had agreed to do the burial anyways, for no cost, as sort of a community service. However, when Captain Lewis poked and prodded and tried to ask for more information about exactly what that meant, Paula would eventually concede that there actually was slightly more to her rationale behind wanting to do Willie's burial. It was not just for charity. 2 days after this interview, police arrested both Paula and her son. And at Paula's trial, the truth surrounding what happened to Willie finally came out. It would turn out Paula's funeral home business was really struggling, to the point where if she couldn't start generating some real money, her business might go under. And she couldn't have that. And so Paula decided she would conduct a prosperity ritual to right her business. But to perform this prosperity ritual, Paula needed a body. And so along comes Willie Suttle, who's died in poverty and his family can't afford his funeral. And Paula says, "Don't worry, I'll take him on for free." But really what she needed was Willie's body. And once Paula and her son had possession of Willie's body, they began the ritual, which started with Paula's son carefully cutting off Willie's left hand. And then the two of them cut Willie's midsection open, removed all his internal organs. And then Paula got out all these voodoo dolls, and she wrote on pieces of paper the names of the other funeral homes, her competitors in the area, and she pinned these pieces of paper to each of these voodoo dolls. And then she took those voodoo dolls and jammed them inside of Willie's abdomen in the empty cavity they had created, and then they stitched him back up. And then she took Willie's body and his organs, and she chucked them into a cheap casket and had him buried. And then she also took the hand that her son had removed, she put it inside of a plastic bag, added some weight to it, and chucked it into the Manatee River. Paula believed this voodoo ritual would literally cause the owners of the other funeral homes, whose businesses she wrote down on the dolls and jammed inside of Willie's body, that this ritual would literally cause all of them to be struck down and killed, putting their businesses out of business, thereby leading to her business prospering once again. However, none of these things came to fruition. The ritual did not work the way Paula intended it to. Instead, the hand that she had thrown into the river ultimately washed ashore, and before long, the police figured out what Paula and her son had done. In 1999, so 2 years after Willie's hand had washed up on shore, Paula and her son were found guilty of desecrating Willie's corpse. Paula's son ultimately served 1 year in prison. As for Paula, her conviction was actually quickly overturned due to a technicality. It was discovered that during an interview with Paula, that police detectives told her that she could not be convicted if this ritual was part of a religious practice, that she was protected under the US Constitution. And so Paula, who confessed to doing this ritual, did so by saying it was part of her religion. She practiced voodoo.
I am a voodooist, and I've survived because I know how to survive. And that's a part of my religion.
And so in court, that confession was ruled inadmissible. And so she won. Here is a photo of the 12 voodoo dolls found inside of Willie's body, with the notes Paula wrote cursing her competition still attached.
Are you the type of person who has binged basically all of my YouTube videos? Every week, you anxiously wait a new upload? If so, thank you, but also you're in luck. Because if you didn't know this, we actually have a separate podcast, the Mr. Ballin Podcast, that has literally hundreds of stories that are not on YouTube that you can binge right now. That podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Again, it's just called the Mr. Ballin Podcast. And on Mondays on that podcast, we upload exclusive new content that is not on YouTube to the podcast. That's Mondays. And then on Thursday, we remaster the audio of your favorite videos on YouTube and put those on the podcast. But again, Mondays, those are brand new and exclusive to the podcast. But if you want to hear those exclusive episodes 1 month ahead of Apple and Spotify and all the other platforms, well, there's only one place you can do that, and that's on Amazon Music. So again, you can go to any podcast platform and find the Mr. Ballin podcast, or if you're like me and you hate waiting, then you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Today's story is a claustrophobic nightmare. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to go skydiving with the like button, but be sure to replace their parachute with a trash bag. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. A little after 3 p.m. on March 22nd, 1959, a 20-year-old British college student named Neil Moss stood in a cavern about 1,000 feet underground in northern England. And as he stood there, he was staring with excitement into this dark hole right in front of him. The cavern that Neil was standing inside of was known as Peak Cavern, and it was one of the biggest and most twisting cave systems in the entire country. In fact, it was so big that at one point, an entire village of 30 rope makers lived inside of this cave. And then also, after those rope makers, the cave system became a hideout for criminals and thieves because there were so many secret passageways and basically places to hide inside of the system. So basically, Peak Cavern was a pretty famous place. And as a result, basically all of it had been mapped out, or at least explored, by scientists and spelunkers, except for this hole right in front of Neil. It was an entrance to a tunnel that nobody even knew about. Neil and the amateur exploration group that he was a part of had discovered this entryway about 2 weeks earlier. Now, neither Neil nor anybody else in this group had actually gone into this hole yet. And the reason for that was it was pretty dangerous. I mean, the opening to this tunnel was pretty small. It was 1.5 feet by 2 feet wide at the opening, and just looking down into it, I mean, it's a dark hole that you really can't tell how tight or how far it even goes. And so once you went inside of it, you know, the deeper you got, the higher the risk of entrapment. And so whoever actually went into this hole really needed to be prepared. But Neil and the rest of his amateur exploration group really felt like it would be worth it to try to go down this tunnel. Not just because nobody had done it before, but specifically, they thought there was a chance that beyond this tunnel, basically deep underground, if you followed it long enough, it could lead to another big open chamber that nobody had found before. And those types of big open chambers, whoever finds them, gets it named after them. And so Neil and his group were thinking, you know, hey, if we find this big chamber, you know, it'll be named after us. We'll be famous, at least in, you know, spelunking circles. But they also understood that there might be nothing at the other end of this tunnel. It could just be a dead end. But the only way to know for sure would be if one of the members of this group went into the hole. Now, in addition to a fear of being trapped in the hole, there were other big issues with blindly crawling into a tunnel no one's been in before. Like, for example, there could be a sudden drop-off, or running water, or some other hazard that whoever went into the hole wouldn't know about until they were facing it. And so naturally, everybody in this group was excited about the hole, but also a little apprehensive about being the guinea pig to actually go into the hole. And so after the group had kind of stood around the hole for a minute, kind of talking through who was gonna do it, Neil had finally courageously volunteered to be the guinea pig. He would go down. And in many ways, Neil was kind of like the perfect candidate for this job. He was smart, he was strong, and most importantly, he was thin, which meant he could navigate a really tight space. The only drawback to Neil was he was pretty tall. He was over 6 feet. And generally speaking, the best cavers in the world are very short and thin because it allows them to get into the smallest, tightest spaces underground. And so Neil, who was standing over the hole, began to mentally prepare himself for what he was about to do. He pulled out his flashlight and he shined it straight down into this hole, which again is a pretty narrow hole, and it basically went straight down. And as he was shining it, he saw about 12 feet down, the hole kind of turned and you couldn't see what was beyond it. And so Neil knew the only part of this trip he would know about is that first 12 feet. Once he made that turn, I mean, everything beyond that was totally unknown. Literally no one in the world knew what was beyond it. Neil was about to find out. The cave explorers anchored this 75-foot-long wire ladder that was all rolled up to this rock that was inside the cavern, right near the opening to this hole. And once that was in place, they spooled out the ladder and kind of dumped it down into the hole. And so it fell 12 feet down and landed right where this tunnel turned and sort of went into oblivion, where nobody knows what happened after that. And so Neil, his job was going to be to go into this hole feet first, go down 12 feet, and then with his feet, as he kind of blindly crawled backwards feet first into the tunnel, he'd be kicking with his feet this ladder, extending it farther and farther into this tunnel. The idea was this ladder was his way back out again. So he's basically on top of the ladder, making his way, and at any point, he can just grab the ladder and climb back out again. And so once the ladder was in place and all the cave explorers were kind of waiting for Neil, Neil walked up to the edge of the hole, he took a deep breath, and then he swung one leg into the hole, placed it on one of the rungs of the ladder, put his other leg on the ladder as well, and kind of tested it to make sure the rock that was anchoring the ladder could hold his weight. Once he was sure it could, he said goodbye to the explorers and then began his descent, feet first, down into the hole. As Neil slowly and carefully climbed down this ladder during this first 12-foot section, he felt the walls of this hole closing in on him. When he was close to the bottom of this first section, the walls were literally flush with his shoulders and back. I mean, this was a really tight space. And so finally he got to the very bottom of this 12-foot section, and he was about to step onto what he thought was another rung, because he can't actually see where he's going. He's just using his feet to feel. And he stepped down and he felt something hard. It was the ground. So he had reached the bottom of the 12-foot section. He kind of tested the ground with his foot, seeing if it would support his weight. And after feeling confident, he stepped off the ladder and just stood at the bottom of the hole. At this point, Neil used his feet to kick the ladder that was still coiled up at the bottom of the hole into the next turn, into the next section of the tunnel that he'd be going down. And as soon as he kicked it, he heard it kind of spool out as it tumbled down this next section. However, it was not a straight drop like this first section was. This next section he'd be going into was more of a gradual decline, just based on the sound this ladder was making as it tumbled down. And so after the ladder had stopped making noise and he knew it had stopped, Neil gave one final look up at his friends above, gave them a little wave, even though he could barely move his hands because it's so tight around him, and then he got down on his stomach and feet